That's pretty close. The Ford's going to carry it.
Here we go.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Right now we have about 74% of the precincts reporting in the state of Kentucky, and President Ford still holds a lead over challenger Ronald Reagan. President Ford with 52,315 votes. That's about 52% of the vote. Reagan has 47,676, about 46%. Tommy Klein out of Louisville still with 1% of the vote, and we have about 2% of the vote uncommitted. President Ford has been declared unofficially a winner in the state of Kentucky over challenger Ronald Reagan. Most of these returns are coming in from the eastern part of the state of Kentucky, where the Republicans are heavy. The Republicans aren't quite as strong in the western part of the state as they are in the eastern part. Ruth Ann, what's happening on the Democratic side?
Well, Carter, as predicted, is walking away with it with 74% of the precincts reporting. We have some new figures coming in right now. Carter has 60% of the vote. Wallace is second with 16%. Udall third with 10%. Ellen McCormick, the Right to Life candidate, with 6%. Scoop Jackson with 3%. Fifi Rockefeller, a local candidate, with 1%, and uncommitted running about 4%. And Harry, voter turnout was so light today, we were told earlier that one newspaper photographer had to go to 4 different polling places in order to find voters to take a picture of for his newspaper.
Speaking of newspaper people, we have with us is our political analyst, Mr. Al Smith, who publishes 5 weekly newspapers in this part of the state of Kentucky. He also has Comment on Kentucky, a public affairs program that's run on Kentucky Educational Television. And Al, in addition to this national race, we've got several local races that are carrying a lot of interest in this part of the country, aren't they?
Right. This year, Edmonson County High School, one of the smallest in the state, surprised everybody by winning the state basketball championship. But they didn't convince their people down in Edmonson County, who today turned down a tax that would have given them a new high school and a new gym to play in. That was Edmonson County at Brownsville, Kentucky. Over in the Land Between the Lakes area, there was something of an upset. Bill Cunningham, a young attorney from Lyons County at New Eddyville, was nominated for a Commonwealth attorney in a tight 3-county race between John O'Hardin and Cunningham and Bill McCaslin of Princeton in Caldwell County. The final unofficial total was 3,300 votes, 3,324 for Bill Cunningham, the nominee apparently, and to 1,202 for John O'Hardin and 2,085 for Bill McCaslin. The significance of that was Mr. Hardin had been appointed by the governor for that term, and he has been defeated. Finally, over in Allen County at Scottsville, Chester Stamps is the nominee of the Democratic Party for county jailer. In a special race, he beat Forrest Smotherman, 229 to 55.
Okay. Thank you, Al. We'll be coming to you from time to time throughout the evening to get your comments on how the vote is going in Kentucky. Again, we still have about 74 to 77% of the vote. President Ford holding a lead over challenger Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter in the #1 spot on the Democratic side, with George Wallace in the 2nd spot at this time with about 77% of the vote in. That's the way it looks here at the Western Kentucky Television Center. Chris?
Stand by.
Okay, Chris, here in Kentucky, we've got an upset. It had been predicted that Ronald Reagan would win in this state, but he's losing to President Ford, and that's a surprise, an upset called by most political observers. Let's take a look at the vote count right now with some 84% of the vote in. President Ford has 53% of the vote with 58,000, almost 59,000 votes. 45% of the votes going to Reagan with some 51,000 votes there. And Tommy Klein out of Louisville with 1% of the vote, and we have 1% that's uncommitted at this time. But Ford leading Reagan in what is considered an upset in Kentucky, 53 to 45% with some 84% of the vote in. And Ruth Ann, what's happening on the Democratic side?
Certainly no upset there. Carter was predicted to win, and he now has 61% of the votes with 84% of the precincts reporting. Translated into delegates, that would be 36 delegates. Wallace is second with 16%. That would be 7 delegates if the race were over now. Udall is third with 10%. That would be 2 delegates. McCormick, the Right to Life candidate with 6%, would have 1 delegate if the race were over now. Scoop Jackson with 2% would not qualify for any delegates. Fifi Rockefeller with 1%, a local candidate, would have no delegates. 4% uncommitted right now. And the interesting thing here is there is no crossover permitted in Kentucky, so you cannot call any of the Republican totals a crossover vote at all because
Right.
it is not permitted. The delegates have been selected in advance, and they will be proportioned according to the
Right.
proportion of the total popular vote that each candidate gets today.
Right, we have some 46 delegates on the Democratic side, some 37 delegates on the Republican side. And we were talking about that Republican race and that being an upset with President Ford defeating Ronald Reagan. We have our political analyst here, Al Smith. And Al, why have we had an upset in Kentucky?
Well, because the Ford people went to work, and the president went to work in Kentucky, Harry. As a matter of fact, a couple of months ago, the president couldn't even get a campaign manager in Kentucky. And the Kentucky Republican Party had some problems getting a chairman. But when they finally settled down, and they decided on a young man named Hal Rogers from Somerset, a Commonwealth attorney over there, to be the state campaign director for the president. Congressman Tim Lee Carter came home and went to work in the 5th Congressional District, a traditionally heavy Republican district, and there's something interesting there. Louis Nunn was backing Governor Reagan, former Governor Louis Nunn, and Congressman Carter's never been too close politically in the Republican Party to Nunn, so he went out and put his prestige on the line against former Governor Nunn. Then also the Republicans in Jefferson County in Louisville are a moderate type compared to in the western part of the state where they're more conservative.
Right.
Jefferson County Republicans got behind the president. The president came here himself to Kentucky last week. He also invited 50 editors up to the White House last week and put his program on the line with them. John Sherman Cooper, the venerable former United States Senator from Kentucky, came home. He called President Ford. He said he's a young Eisenhower, and that got a lot of play. And then finally the president said, I'm also against forced busing. He made this
Matter of fact, I think he said he was going to make Louisville might be his example.
Yeah, he played some politics
Right.
there, and obviously it got him some votes in Jefferson County. All of this, I think, went together. Larry Forgey, a lawyer from Louisville who is from southern Kentucky, says it should be put on the record that President Ford's campaign organization in the first Republican primary and presidential primary in Kentucky history was a jerry-built organization, and it was mostly done by baling wire.
Okay. Again, Chris, our totals here. President Ford in an upset over Ronald Reagan in the state of Kentucky, and Jimmy Carter having no trouble at all in the state of Kentucky right now. And from the Western Kentucky University Center, this is Harry Chapman along with Ruth Ann Leach and Al Smith. Chris? We expected Ronald Reagan to win here in the state of Kentucky. That has turned into an upset with President Ford defeating Ronald Reagan, as you see in our latest returns. In our Republican returns, with 92% of the vote in, President Ford has 53% of the vote, some 64,000 votes to 45% for Ronald Reagan. That's around 54,000 votes. Tommy Klein out of Louisville has 1% of the vote, and we have 1% uncommitted at this time. So President Ford is taking it in an upset over Ronald Reagan in the state of Kentucky. And right now, over on the Democratic side, it's going pretty much as anticipated, Ruth Ann.
It's really no surprise whatsoever. Carter now has 60% of the vote with 90% of the precincts reporting. That would translate into 36 delegates to the National Convention if the vote stands at 60% for Carter. Wallace is in second place with 16% of the vote. He would get 7 delegates if this were the final vote total. Udall, who campaigned hard in Kentucky, is now getting 10% of the vote. That would translate into 2 delegates. Ellen McCormick, the Right to Life candidate, has 6% of the vote and would get 1 delegate. Scoop Jackson has 3% of the vote, would not qualify for any delegates. Neither would Fifi Rockefeller, a local candidate who has 1% of the vote. There are 4% uncommitted, and there would be no delegates there for uncommitted votes.
Right.
Mr. Smith, why is Carter doing so well here?
Well, Carter's doing real well because Ruth Ann, he spent the night at Dale Seitz' house in Henderson about a year ago when Dale Seitz, who became his campaign manager, invited him to come up and speak to the Chamber of Commerce. He called Seitz, who's a 35-year-old industrialist in Henderson, back in January, and he said, manage my campaign. Seitz, who's chairman of the Henderson County School Board, put together a fantastic leapfrog situation. He organized Henderson County. He began to line up the key politicians in the state one by one, beginning with Bill Cox over in Madisonville, Kentucky, who's now a public service commissioner and had managed Julian Carroll's campaign for governor. Cox lined up Ed Pritchard, the veteran political figure and counsel to many governors in Frankfort. Pritchard helped line up Mayor Harvey Sloan of Louisville. Mayor Foster Pettit of Lexington came into line, and on March the 16th, they brought in the big fish, which was Julian Carroll, who flew up from Miami, and brought in Happy Chandler with him, the former Kentucky governor, and Bert Combs. They embraced Julian Carroll embraced Jimmy Carter at the Galt House in Louisville, and it was all over.
So that's how they put it all
That's
together.
how they did it.
In addition,
Western
Al,
Kentucky.
In addition to these races, we've seen the upset on the Republican side, Carter running away as expected. But we've had several local races in this area, especially two that we haven't reported on right now from, I believe, Barron County and Marshall County, where we had local issues involving school taxes. And how have those turned out?
The people in Barron County decided they wanted a new gym. They built 4 schools put together a consolidated school without a gym. They passed a tax to build that gym today by 17 votes. Over in Marshall County, they needed a gym and a new school, but that issue lost by 47 votes, Harry.
Wow.
And in Edmonson County, the people turned down a new school by 963 votes, whereas over in Gilbertsville, over in Marshall County, that town voted to dissolve itself today.
Completely dissolved?
Completely. They had a referendum. They said, let's go out of business.
Times are hard.
Meanwhile, down at the LBL area, Bill Cunningham was nominated for Commonwealth Attorney in a tight 3-way race between Lyons County, Caldwell County, and Trigg County, Kentucky people.
That's a new district, is it
It's a new district created by the governor.
Right.
Bill Cunningham counted heavily on his Trigg County kinfolks. He's from Lyons County, and his kinfolks all voted for him.
I think over in Allen County, we've got Chester Stamps, who's won the Democratic nomination
Chester Stamps is the Democratic nominee for jailer of Allen County.
So look out, folks, in Allen
Right.
County. Okay, it's President Ford winning over Ronald Reagan in the state of Kentucky, and Jimmy Carter going very strong here. And that's the way it shapes up right now from the Western Kentucky University Television Center. Chris? Has 46% of the vote. 58,639 ballots cast, with 17 delegates going to challenger Ronald Reagan. Tommy Klein out of Louisville, Kentucky, got just over 1,000 votes with 1%, and uncommitted went 1%. No delegate votes going there. So the 37 GOP delegate votes, 20 will be going to President Ford, 17 to challenger Ronald Reagan. Ruth Ann, what happened on the Democratic side?
There were no surprises whatsoever. Jimmy Carter currently stands with 59% of the vote, which will translate into about 36 delegates to the National Convention. Wallace is in second place with 17% of the vote. He'll get about 7 delegates to the National Convention. Udall is in third place, having picked up several percentage points. He has 11% of the vote total. We'll get about 2 delegates to the National Convention. Ellen McCormick, the Right to Life candidate, currently has 5% and will get about 1 delegate to the National Convention. Scoop Jackson has 3% of the total vote, will not qualify for any delegates to the National Convention if he doesn't pick up any more percentage points. Fifi Rockefeller, a local candidate, has 1 percentage point, no delegates to the National Convention, and about 4% are uncommitted, Harry.
Okay, that's the way it's shaped up in Kentucky tonight, with President Ford in an upset victory over Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter sweeping the state of Kentucky. Along with Ruth Ann Leach, this is Harry Chapman at the Western Kentucky University Television Center. Here we go. Oh, Chris, okay, Chris, thank you very much. As we've said early and all throughout the night, an upset victory for President Ford here in the state of Kentucky. He picked up some 20 delegates as opposed to 17 delegates for Ronald Reagan. President Ford wound up with 52% of the vote, 46% going for challenger Ronald Reagan. So President Ford picks up 20 delegates here in the state of Kentucky, and Ronald Reagan picks up 17. Ruth Ann, how about the Democratic side?
Jimmy Carter never got lower than 58% all night. He's currently standing at 59%, with 97% of the precincts reporting, was as high as 61. He'll get 37 delegates to the convention. George Wallace, with 17% of the vote, will get 7 delegates to the convention. Morris Udall, with 11% of the vote, will get 2 delegates to the convention. No one else qualifies for any delegates. And since this is our last report, we'd like to thank everyone at the Western Kentucky University Television Center. We've been crewed by broadcast students tonight. They've done a super job, and we'd like to thank each one of them.
A marvelous job indeed, and we want to thank you too, Al Smith, our analyst, for giving us some insight into the local races as well as an oversight of what happened across the state of Kentucky in the races tonight. Thank you so very much for joining us.
Glad to have been here.
Thank you, Al. And this is Harry Chapman along with Ruth Ann Leach at the Western University Kentucky Television Center in Bowling Green. Chris?